May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, Ruth and I had a lovely time in Glasgow last weekend. The sun shone. It was about as cold as this, but the sun shone. And it was the first time that my brother and two sisters and their wives, and I was going to say wives and children, but wives and husbands and stuff, had all got together really since we all lived together back in Eglinton, apart from funerals and weddings. Because that's when you make family, isn't it? Funerals and weddings, if they're far away. So we said we're going to meet up. And of course, lots of stories were told. A lot of them about my sister Diane, because we used to bully her. She was the third child. And then my youngest sister Daphne came along, and Daphne, I know you watch. Yes, you were spoiled. And but the story that made me laugh the most was when I think I was about maybe 7, and my brother would have been about 5. My mother was washing up downstairs at the kitchen sink when suddenly the contents of the window, the glass, fell down in front of her window from upstairs. And there was just glass everywhere outside. So, of course, she came up to investigate what was going on. And she said, what happened? And I said, well, David threw this. It was a big block of wood. My brother David threw at me. It was part of a fort that my father had built for me. And we were arguing over who was going to play with it. And he chucked it at me. And the words have sort of gone into family history of what he said as his excuse. He said it was his fault. He ducked. But, we always try and find fault as human beings, don't we? We find from the very beginning. And when God said, how do you know what's going on? How do you know the difference between good and evil? And Adam says, that woman you gave me, she made me do it. And really, since that time, we've all blamed each other for stuff, don't we? Or if something goes wrong in the world around and there's not someone immediately at hand to blame, we talk about who's at fault, whose fault it is. And we want to know. We want to find out. And that's what the disciples were like when they came across this man who'd been born blind. They found out that he'd been born blind, perhaps just by talking to him, perhaps by overhearing him talking to others. And they said to Jesus, a very strange thing, but maybe it wasn't so strange in those days. They said, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And we'll have a look at that in a moment. But Jesus immediately says, neither this man nor his parents sinned. But he said this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. It's a bit of a clumsy translation, but basically what Jesus is saying is, because things just don't translate immediately from Greek into English, but basically saying is that the point isn't what happened back then. The point is what is about to happen now. That's what you should be interested in. That's what matters. You see, they'd missed the point, really. They saw someone in need. They saw someone begging for his living. And they wanted to know whose fault it was. That wasn't going to help the man. If Jesus had answered, it wouldn't have been the truth, so he wouldn't say it. But if Jesus had answered, it must have been his parents, or it must have been him, they would have been satisfied with that. That was all they were worried about. They just wanted to know whose fault it was. Whereas Jesus was interested in doing something for the man. When we come across someone in difficult circumstances, it's easy to ask ourselves, whose fault is it? And as a society, we still can have this attitude that the Victorians had of the deserving and the undeserving poor, for instance. They had this attitude. Some poor people deserved help because it was through no fault of their own that they were in trouble. Some people didn't because it was their fault. it's just something that still runs through our society a bit. And sometimes the temptation comes, or perhaps we see it and hear it from others. The temptation is to say, oh, well, it's their own fault, or yeah, this has happened because. And think that it's enough to sort out if it's their fault or not, and to move on. Whereas Jesus wanted to help the man. Jesus wanted to show God's glory. Jesus wanted to show the grace and the love and the care of God, and to demonstrate the power of God in changing this man's situation. Now, the Jews did believe that if something happened to you in your early days, it was to do with, if you were ill, it was to do with sin. And if it happened to you from the time you were born, either your parents had sinned or you had sinned in the womb. Which is not something I found taught anywhere in Scripture. But it was to make sense of the world. They honestly believed that sickness came from sin. But Jesus says, no, that's not what it's about. And he's not interested in talking about the cause of it. He's interested in doing something about it. And so he does. He does it in a bit of a strange way. He spits on the ground. That's the sort of thing that used to get us into trouble at school, spitting on the ground. But anyway, it got him into trouble for different reasons. So he spits on the ground and he makes a bit of mud. And that's the point. It was the Sabbath. He was making a bit of mud. He was breaking the rules. And he put it on the man's eyes. Now, if the man could have seen him coming, he might not have let him put mud on his eyes, but of course he couldn't. So he puts the mud on his eyes, and he tells him to go to the pool of Siloam and to wash it off. And off he goes. He had a bit of trust in Jesus, or perhaps he just wanted to wash the mud off his eyes because this strange man had put mud on his eyes. But as he goes and he washes his eyes, he can see. It's a bit of a strange thing to do. But have you noticed that when Jesus heals people, and he heals a lot more than we hear about, but when he heals people, sometimes he just says you're healed and he's healed. Sometimes he does something a bit strange. And in this case, he did something a bit strange. I think it's partly because he uses a different method each time, so people can't think it's about the method. It's about the power of God at work through him. But anyway, he puts the mud on, and he sends him off to the pool of Siloam. And then the man goes home. He finds his way home. I don't know what it was like for him, suddenly being able to see when he couldn't ever see from birth. It must have been very strange. There must have been times, I would guess, when he closed his eyes and thought, I've done this before. I can do it now. I can do it better with my eyes closed. But anyway, he goes home. And then there's the argument about whether it's him or not, or whether it's someone who just looks a bit like him, because these sort of things don't happen. And people couldn't take it in. They really couldn't take in that this had happened, because these things just didn't happen. People who are born blind, who can suddenly see. And so they take him to the religious rulers because something strange has happened. It was too amazing to believe. And they thought, well, we better take it to those who know about these things, who know about God. He said, yeah, this man said, if I do what he said, I'd be healed, I could see. So they take him to the Pharisees. And it's too amazing for them to believe as well. But it's not for the same reason. Because first people were just, well, these things don't happen. The Pharisees, the religious leaders, knew that these things could happen. They knew it could happen. But it was wrong because it had been done on the Sabbath. And you weren't supposed to do any work on the Sabbath. Those are the rules. And so this man must be a sinner. But others were going, how can a sinner do this? It must be God. He caused absolute and utter confusion. How can a sinner do these things? But that was because they were convinced that their way of interpreting the rules was right, and therefore that everything else and everyone else must be wrong. You know what? Down through the centuries, the Church of God has sometimes been more like these Pharisees than the Jesus that we're called to follow. The rules say you must do this, you must do that. I mean, the Sabbath, for instance, is one of them. This strange idea that Christians have a Sabbath, when in Acts, the Gentile Christians are told that they don't have to follow the Sabbath rules. When Paul, in one of his letters, says, don't let anyone judge you by how you keep the Sabbath or not. It's to the point where I remember hearing about, it was a Scottish preacher who traveled 2 days early to his preaching engagement because he found out that the train that he was going to be traveling on to get to his preaching engagement would still be going on a Sunday because it would arrive after midnight, and he couldn't travel on a train on the Sabbath day. And had to go early because of that. I remember someone talking about that, that they really cared about the Sabbath that much. And I thought, well, really? That these people cared about the Sabbath so much that you couldn't do good on it. That you must be a sinner if you make mud by spitting on the ground and putting on a man's eyes. By healing someone. Jesus had problems with people because he healed people on the Sabbath. He healed a man with a withered arm on the Sabbath and got into a lot of trouble for that as well. The rules are the rules are the rules. And they stop us doing what God wants us to do. You'll have heard me say it before, but when asked to say what were the greatest of the commandments, Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and all the prophets are summed up in those two commands. So they got into a right strop. They get into a strop with the man, first of all, and then they call his parents in because, his parents are responsible for him. Well, he's grown up, but his parents are still responsible. How could you have brought up a man, in such a way? And the parents, because they're worried and they're afraid of being chucked out of the synagogue and not allowed to come to worship God. They basically say, well, he's old enough, he can speak for himself. It's not my responsibility, it's him. It's a bit like my brother David saying it's his fault he ducked, And so they drag him in again. They're really upset about this. Someone has just been helped. A man who was born blind can see, and all they can think about are the rules. And you had read to you the to and fro between them. Now, the blind man, knew something about his faith because he said, I think he might be a prophet. And there was actually in the Jewish faith, there was an exemption. Prophets were allowed to do whatever they liked as far as the Jewish people were concerned. If someone was really a prophet, they could break the rules, but they were the only people who could break the rules. And that put them in even more of a test. Until finally, they chucked him out and told him to clear off. Because they wound themselves up into a knot. Do you ever do that? Don't wind yourself up in a knot. I think, in all honesty, in today's society, it's more likely that we're hard on ourselves than we're hard on others. It's more likely that we worry ourselves if we're doing the right thing in the right way. It's more often that I hear Christians saying, well, I'm not sure exactly what God's want me to do, and therefore do nothing. Because they worry they might offend someone. They worry that they might break some rule. They worry because people have told them, well, you can't be a real Christian and do this. While I was at college, I had a friend called Stephen, whose father was a minister as well, and he went on into ministry. And they'd been, while Stephen was younger, in his early teens, they'd been in Canada, in Prince Edward Island, for about 5 years. His father was the minister of a Baptist church over there. And he said it was really weird when we went there. He said the rules are very different in Canada, church in Canada, than they are in Northern Ireland. In Northern Ireland, it still was the thing, really, that Christians didn't watch TV on a Sunday. Yeah, I remember actually once sitting watching television in the elders' house of that church, and him not being very happy about the fact that his son had put the TV on. It was the snooker finals, so, but they got to Canada, and they went out to dinner, as you do with people, stayed in the afternoon on a Sunday, and they said, so what should we do? And Mac, his dad, said, oh, let's play some board games. That'd be fun. Have you got any board games? And they play, oh no, we don't play board games on a Sunday. That would be wrong. But we can watch TV if you want. And the rules were the exact opposite. We all make up rules, maybe sometimes even for ourselves, but perhaps for others. We make up rules about what it means to be a follower of Christ, when the only person we should be following is Christ. And his only two rules that sum it all up are love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbour as yourself. But they were in a right chase. So Jesus hears about this, and off he goes and finds the man. And he talks to the man, and he basically says things like, I'm sorry you got chucked out of the temple. That's not right. And he says, do you believe in the Son of Man? He says, I don't know who the Son of Man is. He said, it's me, the Son of Man. It's me. You've seen him. In fact, I'm the one speaking to you. He said, yes, of course I believe in you. And he bows down and he worships him. And Jesus talks about coming into the world for judgment so that the blind will see and those who see will become blind. And the Pharisees, while they've chucked him out, they've been following him. Some of them have been following him to see what's going on, to see what happens. And they say, are you talking about us? Is it me you mean? You ever feel like that? You ever walk into a room and everyone stops talking and looks at you? And you think, oops, they've been talking about me. And sometimes it's not paranoid. Perhaps they were, and perhaps it was in a good way. But still, they stopped talking. And Jesus says something really quite important. He says, if you were blind, you wouldn't be guilty of sin. He says, but now you claim you can see, your guilt remains. What he's saying to them is, you know exactly what you're doing. You know exactly what you're doing. Because you knew, basically what he's saying to them is, you knew that when a man who is blind from birth can suddenly see, you know it's the work of God. You know it's the work of God. And if it's breaking your rules, then it's the rules that are wrong, not God that is wrong. I think one of the things we need to learn as Christians is learn to see God at work in our world around us, to see God at work in our own lives, to see what he has done in our lives, to see what he does in our lives, to see his grace at work in our lives. First of all, we need to see and we need to understand, and perhaps for most of it, it's a matter of remembering that we've put our lives into his hands and that he's forgiven us the wrong things we've done, and he's restored that relationship with him. And when the enemy comes and tells us that we're no good, or there you again, you failed again, or the sort of things that come into our thoughts and into our hearts, into our minds and into our hearts, when things go wrong, we shouldn't listen, but instead listen to God, who tells us that he loves us, that he cares for us, and that he has forgiven us. And then remember, when we come up against or come across people that we find difficult, or situations that we find strange or difficult, that we see the opportunity for God to work in the midst of them. See the opportunity for perhaps an act of kindness, a listening ear, a word spoken through trembling lips because we're so desperate not to get things wrong. But we speak anyway of the love and the grace of God and see God do what he does in that situation. Or are we blind? We claim we can see. We claim to be followers of Christ. But if we don't see him at work, if we don't recognize his work, if we don't recognize his work, the work that he's done in us, I'm a very different person than I would be without the grace of God in my life. I joke about loving cars and loving fast cars. And there is some of that in me. I wind Ruth up by saying I'd like an Audi RS6, and she winds me up in return by telling me, no, you're not having one, you'd be dead in a week. And I say, of course I would, so I know I won't have one. But you know, I grew up fascinated. I grew up fascinated with cars, with driving them fast. I remember it once didn't turn out that great. It was okay, but in Northern Ireland, there were often roadblocks set up, particularly on country roads, and I was doing a speed that I shouldn't really have been doing on a country road. And I came round a corner, and there were two Army Land Rovers kind of pointing like that, with a bit of gap in the middle, and a soldier doing this. And I think I may have stopped about that far from him. That did change my life a bit. And as I drove off, having had my vehicle thoroughly checked, I remember seeing at the side of the road the soldier with the machine gun, not pointing forwards towards the traffic that was coming, but the other way, to get someone who would blow through the checkpoint. I still like cars, but you know, they're not the be-all and end-all. I thought, as I was growing up, I would become a pilot in the RAF. I wanted the glory of all of that. I went to university, first of all, to do aero engineering, telling God that I might work with Mission Aviation Fellowship if I became a pilot. I don't think I had any intention of that. But God turned my life around and called me to follow him and to walk with him. The biggest change that God has made in me is that he softened my heart in ways that I think the younger Duncan would not have recognized. And it's helped me down through the years to see people very differently. And it's been a challenge to me to look at myself and to ask, what work does God still have to do in me? And my challenge to you as I finish is, what work does God still have to do in you as you claim to follow Christ, as I do? What work does God still have to do so that we might be more effective disciples of his and witnesses for him? May God bless you in this coming week. Amen. Let's sing.